It was a warm spring day, and the sun cast a golden glow over the busy city streets. The air was filled with the sounds of chatter, laughter, and the occasional honking of horns as people went about their usual routines. In the heart of the city, excitement buzzed through the crowd gathered along the parade route. Today was no ordinary day. It was the day the royal family's guards would march in the grand procession, and everyone was eager to witness the impressive display of ceremonial pageantry. Flags fluttered in the breeze, and people crowded together to catch a glimpse of the royal guardsmen in their pristine uniforms, their tall, proud figures marching in perfect synchrony. Among the crowd stood a young family, eager to experience the celebration. They weren't like the others, dressed in their Sunday best, enjoying the event with a carefree attitude. This family had been through more than anyone should ever have to endure. The little boy, named Ethan, stood beside his parents, holding onto his mother's hand tightly. His small frame looked fragile under the bright sunlight, and the smile on his face was faint but genuine. Ethan was only 8 years old, but he had been battling cancer for months. Despite the long, difficult treatments and the toll they had taken on his body, Ethan had insisted on going to see the royal procession. He didn't want to miss out on something so special, even if his body wasn't up to the challenge. Ethan's parents were worn out, but they tried to be optimistic for their son. His mother, with her soft eyes, bent down to adjust his hat, brushing his hair away from his forehead. "How are you feeling, sweetie?" she asked gently. Ethan smiled up at her, his eyes a little too bright for his age. "I'm fine, Mom," he replied, his voice soft but determined. He didn't want to worry her. He was tired, yes, but he didn't want his illness to take away something he looked forward to, something that could make him feel like a regular boy for just a little while. As the sound of drums and trumpets filled the air, signaling the start of the parade, the crowd grew excited. People cheered as the first of the royal guards marched into view. The guardsmen wore their signature red coats, their tall bearskin hats gleaming in the sunlight. Ethan's eyes widened in awe as he watched the procession move past them, his face lighting up with wonder. His parents stood back, watching him with love in their eyes. This small moment, this tiny sliver of joy, meant the world to them. But as the parade continued, something changed. Ethan had been standing for a while now, his small body beginning to tremble with the effort of staying upright. He wasn't the same energetic child he once was. The treatments had taken a toll, draining him of his strength. His head began to swim, the world around him seeming to tilt as dizziness overtook him. His grip on his mother's hand tightened, but he could feel himself losing control. His mother noticed the change immediately. "Ethan, are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling with concern. "I'm fine, Mom," Ethan whispered, trying to stay steady. But his voice betrayed him, sounding weaker than usual. The bright colors of the parade blurred in front of his eyes, and the sounds of the crowd faded into the background as his body fought to stay conscious. He took a few shaky steps forward, hoping to make it through, but it was no use. The exhaustion had finally caught up with him, and before he knew it, everything went dark. As Ethan's body gave way, he collapsed in front of a tall, imposing figure. It was one of the royal guardsmen, standing at attention as he had been trained to do. The guardsman's eyes quickly scanned the scene, noticing the small boy lying on the ground, his parents rushing to his side in panic. Ethan's father knelt down, his face pale with worry, while his mother held her son's head, crying softly. The guardsman, who had remained still and composed throughout the parade, now found himself in an unexpected position. His job had always been to stand tall and steady, to protect and serve the royal family. But today that duty was about to change. The moment Ethan fell, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The people around him gasped. Some took a step back, unsure of what to do, while others quickly moved forward to help. His parents were frantic, their voices filled with worry and panic. Ethan's father, his face pale with fear, reached out to scoop Ethan into his arms, but the small boy was limp, his face pale, and his body cold. His mother knelt beside him, brushing his hair from his forehead, whispering his name in desperation, hoping he would open his eyes. The royal guardsman, who had been standing stoically just moments before, now found himself in an unexpected situation. The crowd around him began to murmur, some looking at the guardsman for guidance, while others were too focused on the child to notice anything else. The guardsman's role was clear, to stand tall, proud, and unwavering. But today, duty was calling him in a way he had never imagined. Without a second thought, the guardsman stepped forward, his boots clicking against the ground. The crowd fell silent, watching in awe as the imposing figure approached the child. The guardsman's face, usually stern and impassive, now softened as he knelt beside Ethan and his parents. His tall, strong frame seemed even larger in comparison to the frail little boy lying on the ground. His heart raced, not from fear, but from a deep instinct to help. The guardsman had been trained for countless situations, but this moment of vulnerability, was unlike anything he had ever faced. The first thing the guardsman did was check for any obvious signs of injury. He gently placed a hand on Ethan's wrist, feeling for a pulse. It was weak but steady. He let out a quiet sigh of relief. The boy was alive, but it was clear he needed medical attention. The guardsman's mind quickly processed the next steps. He reached up and signaled to the other guards, who were still standing watch over the crowd. Call for medical assistance, he instructed in a low, commanding voice. But even as he gave the order, his attention never wavered from Ethan. Ethan's parents were in a state of shock. The fear in their eyes was evident, but there was also something else, something they hadn't expected. As the guardsman knelt beside their son, there was a tenderness in his movements, a softness in his voice, as he gently reassured them that help was on the way. "He'll be all right," the guardsman said quietly, his tone calm and steady. The words, though simple, were a comfort in the midst of the chaos. Ethan's mother looked up at the guardsman, her face tear-streaked, and nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what to believe. She wanted to trust the man's words, but seeing her son in such a fragile state left her unsure. The guardsman stayed by Ethan's side, never once taking his eyes off the child. He watched as Ethan's eyelids fluttered slightly, as if he were struggling to wake up. Slowly, very slowly, Ethan's tiny chest began to rise and fall more evenly, his breathing steadier. The crowd around them had grown silent, all eyes on the scene unfolding in front of them. Some people were still in shock, others unsure of what to do, but no one dared to interrupt the quiet calm that had settled around the boy and the guardsman. It was a strange, surreal moment. Here, in the midst of a grand royal procession, a young boy's life was being tended to not by a doctor or paramedic, but by a royal guardsman, someone who was sworn to protect, not heal. The guardsman didn't seem to mind the strange turn of events. He was focused entirely on Ethan, his stoic demeanor softened by his concern. As he sat there, watching over the boy, something inside him shifted. The duty to protect had always been about keeping order, ensuring safety, and following the rules. But now it was something deeper, something far more human than the rigid training he had undergone. This was about a life, about a young boy who, despite all his struggles, still had so much life to live. The medical team arrived quickly, their sirens cutting through the stillness of the crowd. They moved efficiently, immediately taking over where the guardsman had left off, checking Ethan's vitals, and preparing to take him to the hospital. The guardsman stood up slowly, stepping back to give the paramedics room to work. But his eyes never left Ethan's face, watching as the boy was gently lifted and placed onto a stretcher. He didn't say anything, but the quiet concern in his gaze spoke volumes. Ethan's parents, though still shaken, felt a wave of gratitude wash over them. The man who had been so strong, so impassive, had shown them kindness in their darkest moment. The guardsman, a symbol of stoic strength, had proven that even the most disciplined among us can find moments of compassion. The crowd began to murmur again, some whispering words of admiration for the guardsman, who had done more than his duty. He had shown the world the power of kindness in the face of crisis. As the medical team rushed to take control of the situation, the Royal Guardsman stood off to the side, watching quietly. He knew that his job was done for now, but a part of him couldn't tear his gaze away from Ethan, still lying unconscious on the stretcher. The crowd, still in awe of the Guardsman's unexpected intervention, began to murmur among themselves, their whispers filled with admiration and respect. The man who had spent years in rigorous training to serve and protect now found himself in an unfamiliar role, one that was far more human than he ever expected. Ethan's parents, still visibly shaken, held each other tightly as the paramedics worked. The boy was still unconscious, but there were signs of improvement. His breathing had steadied, and his color was slowly returning to his cheeks. The paramedic spoke softly, telling the parents not to worry. They were doing everything they could, and they were taking him to the hospital for further tests and treatment. But despite the medical team's reassurances, Ethan's mother couldn't shake the knot of fear in her stomach. She looked at the Guardsman, whose calm presence seemed to offer a small measure of comfort in the overwhelming chaos. The Guardsman caught her gaze, and for the first time, he allowed his face to soften further. There was no cold professionalism in his eyes now. His heart, which had once been disciplined to remain unflinching, now felt a pang of empathy for the parents and their son. He nodded at them, his words simple but sincere. "He'll be all right. They're doing everything they can." Ethan's mother, still holding back tears, whispered a soft thank you, her voice trembling. She had not expected this. She had not expected the Guardsman to not only perform his duties with unwavering precision, but to show such kindness in the face of something far more fragile than he was used to. His reaction had been so different from what she had imagined. In that moment, she realized that not all heroes wore capes or had flashing sirens. Some were silent and strong, standing quietly in the background, doing their part in a way that no one could truly appreciate until they saw it for themselves. As the stretcher was carefully lifted into the ambulance, the Guardsman turned to walk back toward his position. He had to return to his post and continue his duty. But something in his heart had changed, and he could no longer simply go back to standing at attention without thinking about what had just happened. He had been part of something much bigger than his usual role. He had made a difference. In that brief moment when he had knelt by Ethan's side, he had witnessed the true meaning of compassion and care, and it had moved him deeply. Before he could take his next step, someone from the crowd called out to him. It was a woman, with tears still glistening in her eyes. She came forward, walking slowly, as though not entirely sure what to say. When she reached him, she stopped and took a breath, then looked up at the Guardsman with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You saved him. I don't know what we would have done without you." The words were simple, but they carried so much weight. The Guardsman, though typically reserved, felt his chest tighten. His usual stoic expression softened, and he nodded once, his lips curling slightly upward in acknowledgement. The woman continued, "You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to kneel, to care. But you did, and we won't forget it." The Guardsman stood silently, taking in her words. He had only done what anyone would have done in that situation, but her gratitude was overwhelming. It wasn't just a thank you. It was recognition of his humanity, something that the Guardsman rarely allowed others to see. He didn't respond immediately, unsure of how to articulate what he was feeling. Words often failed him in moments like these. Instead, he simply gave a small but meaningful nod, then turned back toward his post. As he resumed his place in the procession, he couldn't shake the feeling of the woman's eyes on him. She wasn't the only one who had witnessed the moment. The crowd had seen everything. How a man who was supposed to stand still and unyielding had shown a gentler side of himself, one that resonated deeply with the people who had witnessed it. In the days that followed, the story of the Royal Guardsman's reaction spread quickly. People talked about it, not just because of the dramatic turn of events, but because of the Guardsman's quiet but powerful act of kindness. News outlets picked up the story, sharing the image of a Royal Guardsman, usually a figure of discipline and formality, showing care and concern for a small boy in need. The guardsman's actions were more than just a duty fulfilled. They were a reminder that sometimes, in the most unexpected places, humanity shines brightest. And for Ethan's family, the gratitude they felt was overwhelming. Though Ethan was still recovering and there were difficult days ahead, they found comfort in the kindness of the royal guardsman. The quiet strength of the man who had been their unexpected protector would remain in their hearts forever. Days passed, and Ethan's condition slowly began to improve. His parents, though still shaken by the events of that day, tried to focus on his recovery. He had been admitted to the hospital for a few days to monitor his condition, and although he was still weak, he was on the mend. The medical staff assured them that it was nothing more than a momentary lapse in his health due to exhaustion from the cancer treatments. However, the memory of that day, the day Ethan fainted in front of the royal guardsman, lingered in their minds. Ethan's mother couldn't stop thinking about how the guardsman had acted. The more she thought about it, the more amazed she was by his response. At the time, she had been so worried and overwhelmed that she hadn't fully processed what had happened. But as the days passed, the image of the tall, stoic guardsman kneeling beside her son and offering comfort began to fill her thoughts. She was deeply grateful for the kindness he had shown. It wasn't just that he helped her son. It was the way he did it. There had been no hesitation, no sense of duty that felt forced. It was as though he genuinely cared, as if Ethan was as important to him as his own family. Her thoughts often drifted to the brief but powerful moment they shared. She realized that it wasn't the guardsman's uniform or the royal setting that had made the situation so extraordinary. It was the humanity he displayed in a time of crisis. In a world that often felt too cold, too disconnected, this simple act of kindness had pierced through the noise and left an impression she would never forget. As for Ethan, he began to ask more questions about the guardsman. "Do you think he'll come visit me?" he asked one evening as he lay in his hospital bed, his small hands gripping the blanket tightly. His parents exchanged a look. They knew the answer, but they didn't want to disappoint their son. "I'm not sure, honey," his mother replied softly, "but he did something very special for you. I'm sure he'll always remember you." Ethan smiled faintly, his bright eyes filled with hope. "Maybe we can thank him someday," he whispered, and his mother smiled, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. Although the guardsman had returned to his post after the incident, his act of kindness did not go unnoticed. Word of his actions spread quickly, not just through the crowd of the parade, but also among the royal family. It wasn't long before the Queen herself had heard about what had happened. She was deeply moved by the story, and so was the rest of the royal family. The guardsman, who had once been a figure of stoic discipline and distant authority, had shown the world a side of him that few had ever seen. It wasn't long before the Queen decided to personally reach out to Ethan's family. One afternoon, a letter arrived at the hospital. It was from the royal palace. Ethan's mother opened it with trembling hands, unsure of what to expect. Inside was a handwritten note from the Queen herself, offering her deepest thanks for the kindness the guardsman had shown. She expressed her admiration for Ethan's bravery and the strength of his family. The Queen wrote that she hoped to meet Ethan and his family in person once he was well enough, and that she would like to invite them to the palace as a gesture of appreciation for the courage they had shown. When Ethan's parents read the letter aloud, Ethan's eyes grew wide with disbelief. "The Queen?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. "She wants to meet us." His mother nodded, her own eyes brimming with tears. "Yes, sweetie. It looks like we're going to meet the Queen." Ethan couldn't contain his excitement. The idea of meeting royalty had always seemed so far away, so out of reach. But now it felt so close, almost within his grasp. A few days later, once Ethan had recovered enough, the family made their way to the palace. It was a surreal experience, walking through the grand halls and corridors, surrounded by history and elegance. But even in such a majestic setting, Ethan's family couldn't help but focus on the deeper significance of the visit. This wasn't just about meeting royalty. It was about the kindness and humanity that had connected them to this royal family in the first place. When they finally met the Queen, Ethan and his parents were overwhelmed by the warmth she radiated. The Queen, though regal in her bearing, greeted them with genuine kindness and compassion. She made Ethan feel like the most important person in the room, asking him questions about his favorite things and offering her best wishes for his recovery. But it wasn't just the Queen who made the visit so special. It was the moment when the Guardsman, the one who had kneeling beside Ethan that fateful day, stepped forward. The Guardsman, now standing before Ethan with a warm smile on his face, spoke softly. "It's an honor to meet you, young man," he said, his voice kind and full of respect. Ethan, still a little shy, reached out to shake his hand, his small fingers gripping the man's much larger hand. "Thank you for helping me," Ethan said quietly, his eyes filled with gratitude. The Guardsman's heart swelled with pride. He had never expected such a simple act to lead to something so meaningful. And in that moment, as the two of them stood there, the connection between them was clear. Two people, from very different worlds, bound together by a shared moment of kindness. Ethan's family would never forget that day. It was a day that reminded them that, no matter the circumstances, there was always room for compassion, for care, and for humanity. The Royal Guardsmen had shown them that the true strength of a person wasn't in their uniform or their title, but in the kindness they were willing to show to others, especially when it mattered most. The day Ethan and his family visited the palace was a day they would carry with them forever. The grandeur of the royal setting was not what left the deepest impression on them. Rather, it was the kindness and genuine warmth they received from the Queen and the Royal Guardsmen that would stay in their hearts. As they made their way back to the hospital after their visit, Ethan couldn't stop talking about the experience. His eyes were wide with wonder as he described the palace to his parents, and even though his voice was still weak from his recent illness, his enthusiasm was contagious. He had always loved the idea of royalty, of castles and crowns, but this was different. It wasn't the pomp and circumstance that excited him. It was the human connection, the kindness he had felt from the people who were supposed to be untouchable figures. The Queen had made him feel special, like he was the most important person in the world. And the Guardsman, with his quiet, steady presence, had done something even more remarkable. He had shown Ethan that even the strongest, most stoic people could be deeply compassionate. Ethan's parents, though still processing the overwhelming kindness they had experienced, found comfort in their son's joy. It had been a difficult few months, filled with uncertainty and fear, but for the first time in a long while, they could see the light at the end of the tunnel. Their son was not just surviving cancer, he was thriving, buoyed by the kindness and love he had received from unexpected sources. It gave them hope, hope that no matter how tough the journey, there were still good people in the world, willing to offer a helping hand when needed. As days passed, Ethan's recovery continued at a steady pace. His strength began to return, and his spirit, though still fragile, was reignited. Every day, he grew more energetic, more curious about the world around him. His parents were overjoyed to see him so full of life again. They had learned to cherish the small moments, the simple joys that they had once taken for granted. They knew their son still had a long road ahead of him, but seeing him smile again gave them more hope than any doctor's prescription ever could. During this time, the story of the Royal Guardsman's kindness spread far and wide. It wasn't just a story of a man helping a child. It was a story of humanity, of reaching across divides and offering kindness when it was most needed. People from all walks of life shared the story, and many were touched by the simple act of care shown by someone who had every reason to remain distant and unaffected. The Guardsman, though a figure of strength and discipline, had demonstrated that true courage wasn't just about facing physical danger. It was about stepping out of one's comfort zone and showing empathy when it mattered most. For Ethan and his family, the kindness didn't end with their visit to the palace. The Guardsman, although he had returned to his usual duties, reached out to them in small but meaningful ways. He would send them messages, asking how Ethan was doing and wishing him well. His gestures, though small, meant the world to Ethan's parents. It reminded them that kindness wasn't a one-time act. It was something that could be sustained, something that could grow over time. The Guardsmen had touched their lives in a way they would never forget, and they knew that the bond they had formed was something that would last far beyond the royal procession. Ethan, for his part, began to understand the deeper meaning of the kindness he had received. He wasn't just a little boy who had fainted in front of a royal guard. He was someone who had been seen, someone who had been cared for in a moment of need. And that realization gave him strength. He became more determined, more focused on his recovery. He wanted to show the world that the kindness he had been given had not been wasted. He wanted to live his life in a way that honored the people who had helped him through his darkest days. As the months went by, Ethan's health continued to improve. He returned to school, to the playground, to the simple joys of being a child. But he carried something with him, a sense of gratitude and compassion that far exceeded his years. He had learned, through the actions of the royal guardsmen, that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could make the biggest difference. And as he grew, he vowed to pay that kindness forward. Ethan's parents, too, carried the lesson of kindness with them. They had witnessed firsthand how a single moment of care could change the course of someone's life. They had learned to be more present, more compassionate, and to never take a moment of peace for granted. The royal guardsmen had shown them that no matter how big or small the gesture, kindness always had a way of coming full circle. It wasn't just a story about a boy who fainted and a guardsman who helped him. It was a story of the ripple effects that kindness can have, how one simple act can spread out into the world, touching lives in ways that are impossible to measure. For Ethan and his family, that day was a turning point, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always room for light. As Ethan's recovery continued, life began to feel a bit more normal again. The once heavy weight of fear and uncertainty slowly lifted from his family's shoulders. The road to healing wasn't always smooth, and there were still difficult days, but each one felt like a step closer to the future they had dreamed of. Ethan was a fighter, and the strength he showed through his battle with cancer inspired not only his family, but everyone around him. It was during this time that Ethan's parents decided to reach out to the royal family, not just as a gesture of gratitude, but to share with them how much the kindness of the royal guardsmen had meant. They wanted to express how a simple act of compassion could change someone's life so profoundly. They wrote a heartfelt letter to the palace, sharing their appreciation for the guardsman's actions that day, the way he had gone beyond what was expected of him, and offered a quiet comfort in their moment of crisis. Weeks passed, and life carried on. Ethan had returned to his routine, attending school and meeting with friends again. The once distant thought of the royal procession had faded somewhat, but his parents often talked about the guardsman and the way he had handled the situation. It wasn't just about the public recognition or the royal gestures. It was about the humanity that had been shown in a moment when everything could have gone wrong. It had reminded them that, despite all the uncertainty they faced with Ethan's illness, there was still goodness in the world. Small, everyday acts of kindness that could make a world of difference. Then, one morning, as Ethan was finishing his breakfast, there was a knock at the door. It was a delivery, but this one was unlike anything they had received before. Inside was a beautiful box, adorned with a royal seal. It was addressed to Ethan, and as his mother opened it, her hands trembling, she found something that brought a wave of emotion crashing over her. Inside the box was a letter, this time from the royal guardsman himself. Along with the letter was a small token, a medallion with an engraving that read, "Courage is found in the smallest acts of kindness." The letter was simple yet incredibly meaningful. The guardsman had written to thank Ethan for the joy he had brought into his life, for showing him that even the smallest gestures of care could have a lasting impact. He had written about how he was moved by Ethan's bravery and strength, how witnessing that moment of connection had left a lasting mark on him as well. The guardsman had always known the importance of duty, but he now understood more deeply the importance of compassion, how it could heal and give hope in a way that rigid duty never could. Ethan's parents read the letter aloud, their voices thick with emotion. As they spoke, Ethan sat quietly beside them, the weight of the words sinking in. The guardsman's kindness had not been a one-time act. It had left an imprint on his heart, and he wanted to share that sentiment with Ethan. The token, the medallion, was a symbol of their connection. It was a reminder that Ethan's strength, his courage, had not gone unnoticed. In the simplest of ways, the guardsman had acknowledged the profound impact of their brief encounter. Ethan took the medallion into his hands, feeling its weight. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a reminder of the bond that had been formed in a moment of crisis. It was a reminder that even in the most difficult times, there were people who cared, people who would go above and beyond to offer comfort and support. He thought of the guardsman, how, despite his towering presence and stoic demeanor, he had shown so much tenderness. It made Ethan realize that strength didn't always have to be loud or forceful. Sometimes, the greatest strength was in being gentle, in reaching out to help when it wasn't expected, when it was most needed. Ethan's parents felt a deep sense of gratitude for the royal family, for the guardsmen, and for everyone who had shown them kindness. They had learned that kindness was a gift that could transform a life, that small acts of care could ripple out into the world and create something beautiful. They knew that Ethan's recovery was not just about the medical treatment he received. It was about the love and support that had surrounded him during the hardest days of his life. In the weeks that followed, the family continued to feel the effects of the kindness they had experienced. They took every opportunity to pay it forward, to help others in their community who were struggling, to show that the compassion they had received could be spread. They volunteered at local charities, donated to cancer research, and tried to bring hope to others facing similar battles. It became their mission to share the same spirit of kindness that had been shown to them. As for Ethan, he wore the medallion around his neck every day. It became his constant reminder of the strength that lay within him, of the kindness that had been shared, and of the power of human connection. He knew that life wasn't always easy, that there would be hard days ahead, but he also knew that no matter what, there were always people who cared, and that knowledge gave him the courage to face whatever came next with an open heart. Ethan's journey, though marked by pain and struggle, was also filled with moments of unexpected beauty. It was the beauty of kindness, of compassion, and of the quiet acts of humanity that could make the world feel like a brighter, more hopeful place. It was a lesson that would stay with him forever, one that he would carry into every chapter of his life. As the days continued to pass, Ethan's health improved, and the worries that once weighed so heavily on his family began to ease. The chemotherapy treatments, though exhausting, were slowly showing positive results. Ethan had more energy than he had in weeks, and although he still had a long way to go, his spirits had lifted. He was returning to the life of a young boy, filled with curiosity, laughter, and hope. However, the memory of the royal guardsman and the kindness he had shown during the most frightening moment of their lives still lingered in the family's hearts. It wasn't just a memory. It had become a part of who they were now, shaping their outlook on life and how they viewed the world. The simple act of a man, in a uniform designed for discipline and strength, kneeling down beside a frightened boy in need, had changed them all. Ethan's parents decided they wanted to share this story, not for any recognition, but because they felt that the guardsman's act of compassion was something that deserved to be remembered. It was a rare reminder that even in a world that often felt chaotic and disconnected, there were still people who truly cared for others, who went beyond their duties and made a lasting difference. Ethan's mother began to write a letter to the royal guardsman, expressing their heartfelt gratitude for the kindness he had shown and how much it meant to them. She felt it was important to let him know that his actions had made a bigger impact than he could ever know. But as the letter was being written, a letter arrived for Ethan, not from the guardsman, but from the royal palace itself. This letter, delivered with great ceremony, carried a message from the Queen. It was a formal invitation for Ethan and his family to visit the palace again, but this time there would be more to it. The Queen had read about Ethan's recovery, and in honor of his courage and strength, she wanted to personally thank him. She also wanted him to meet other members of the royal family who had been moved by his story. Ethan's parents couldn't believe it. The gesture was overwhelming. The family had never expected anything like this, never imagined that a simple, vulnerable moment in front of a royal guardsman would lead to such kindness from the highest levels of royalty. It was a humbling reminder that there were people who recognized the value of human connection, no matter how small or fleeting the encounter might have seemed. When the day came for the visit, the family made their way to the palace once again. This time, however, there was no fear, no sense of uncertainty hanging over them. They were excited, thrilled to be able to meet the Queen and the royal family, but even more excited to show their gratitude for the unexpected kindness that had been extended to them. They felt as if this journey had come full circle. Ethan was healthy, his spirit lifted, and they were about to meet the people who had been a part of that healing. Upon their arrival at the palace, they were greeted warmly, not by the formalities they had expected, but by a sense of genuine care. The Queen herself came to greet them, a smile on her face as she extended her hand to Ethan. She spoke with such warmth, asking how he was feeling and telling him how proud she was of his strength and perseverance. Ethan's parents, overwhelmed by the Queen's kindness, could hardly find the words to express their gratitude. But they didn't need to. The Queen understood. Her eyes were filled with compassion, and her presence radiated kindness. After a brief meeting, the family was escorted into a grand hall where other members of the royal family had gathered. Ethan, though shy at first, found himself smiling and laughing as the royal family members spoke to him with such kindness. The Guardsman, whom they had met during that fateful day, stood quietly in the background. He had not been called upon to perform any official duties that day. Instead, he had been invited to join in the meeting, not as a soldier, but as a man who had made a difference in the lives of a family. When Ethan spotted the Guardsman, his face lit up with recognition. He walked over, his small hand reaching out to him. "Thank you for helping me," Ethan said, his voice filled with sincerity. The Guardsman smiled, his face softening for the first time since they had met. "It was my honor, young man," he replied quietly. The moment felt significant, more than just a simple exchange of thanks. It was the culmination of everything they had been through. The shared understanding that kindness could bridge gaps, even in the most unexpected places. The Guardsman had become more than just a figure of authority to Ethan. He had become a symbol of compassion and care. It wasn't the uniform or the position that mattered. It was the person beneath it, the one who had shown Ethan and his family that even in the face of difficulty, there were people willing to help. As they spent the day at the palace, sharing stories and laughter, Ethan and his family couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in just a few short months. It had been a journey filled with hardship, but it had also been one filled with unexpected moments of kindness, moments that had made all the difference in the world. They left the palace that day with full hearts, knowing that the kindness they had received was not just a fleeting moment, but something that had shaped their lives forever. For Ethan, the medallion that hung around his neck was more than just a gift. It was a reminder of the strength that kindness could offer, and how even the smallest actions could have a lasting impact on someone's life. He knew that, no matter what the future held, he would always carry that lesson with him. As time passed, Ethan's life began to settle into a new rhythm. The treatments, though still demanding, were becoming more manageable, and he was starting to feel stronger each day. He was back to school, surrounded by friends and teachers who supported him, and his days were filled with laughter and the excitement of being a kid again. But even as his health improved, he carried something special with him, a deep sense of gratitude that shaped the way he viewed the world. Every time he looked at the small medallion that hung around his neck, he was reminded of the kindness that had been shown to him. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of the unexpected support he had received from a royal guardsman, and later, the royal family. It was a reminder of how a single act of compassion could change the course of someone's life. And for Ethan, It had changed everything. How he saw himself, how he saw others, and how he approached the world around him. His parents, too, felt the lasting effects of that moment. They had been through a harrowing journey, one filled with fear and uncertainty. But they had also seen the power of human connection, of simple gestures of kindness that had given them the strength to keep going. They had learned that even in the darkest times, there was always room for light. Sometimes, that light came in the form of a stranger offering help when it was needed most. Ethan's mother, who had been the one to write the letter of gratitude to the Guardsman, often thought back to the days when they were in the hospital, unsure of what the future held. She had feared the worst, but she had also learned to hope, to trust in the kindness of others. She would never forget the moment when the Guardsman had knelt beside Ethan, showing more empathy and tenderness than she had ever expected from a person in such a position of authority. It had been a moment of grace, one that had lifted her spirits and given her the courage to keep fighting for her son. As the weeks and months went by, Ethan and his family continued to stay in touch with the royal family. The Guardsman, though still committed to his duties, would occasionally send messages of encouragement, checking in on Ethan's progress. It was a quiet yet profound reminder that their connection was not just a one-time event. It had blossomed into something much deeper, something that could not be broken by time or distance. For Ethan, life began to feel like a new adventure. He was no longer just the sick little boy he had been. He was a survivor, a young man who had faced unimaginable challenges and come out stronger. He carried the lesson of kindness with him, sharing it with his friends and teachers. He would always remember how a simple, kind act had made a world of difference in his life, and he wanted to pay that kindness forward. One afternoon, while playing outside with his friends, Ethan noticed a new student in his class who seemed a little shy, a little out of place. The boy was standing alone, watching the others play, unsure of how to join in. Ethan didn't hesitate. He walked over to the boy, smiled, and introduced himself. "Hi, I'm Ethan. Do you want to play with us?" The boy's eyes lit up with surprise and relief, and he nodded eagerly. That simple act, that small gesture of kindness, reminded Ethan of what he had learned during his own battle. Sometimes, all it took was one person to make you feel seen, to make you feel welcome. As the day went on, Ethan couldn't help but feel proud of the connection he had made. It wasn't just about making someone else feel good. It was about spreading the kindness that had been shown to him. It was about making the world a little brighter, one small act at a time. And as he looked at the boy laughing and playing with his new friends, Ethan knew that this was just the beginning. He had learned that kindness didn't need to be grand or dramatic. It just needed to be sincere. And the more people practiced it, the more it would spread. Back at home, Ethan's parents saw the changes in him. He was more confident, more empathetic. They watched him, proud of the young man he was becoming. He was no longer just their son who had been fighting for his life. He was a person who was using his own experiences to make the world a better place. They knew that his journey wasn't over, that there would still be struggles ahead, but they also knew that Ethan had something that would carry him through whatever came next, a deep understanding of what it meant to be kind, to care for others, and to make a difference in the world. As the seasons changed, so did Ethan's outlook on life. He had faced a battle he had never expected, and yet he had emerged from it stronger and more determined than ever. He understood that life wasn't just about surviving. It was about living, about connecting with others, and about showing kindness when it mattered most. He knew that the world could be a tough place, but he also knew that, with the right mindset and the right heart, it could be a place of incredible beauty. And so, as the years went on, Ethan carried the lessons he had learned with him. He never forgot the kindness of the royal guardsman, the queen, and everyone who had made a difference in his life. And as he grew older, he found new ways to share that kindness with the world, paying forward the love and compassion that had saved him when he needed it most.